get approached to do lots of talks. What I really loved about this one was the notion of disrupting an idea. And the idea that was disrupted comes from a very personal place for me. I'm an only child. I'm super close to my cousin Alexia. She's like my sister. When she was a young teenager, though, she developed a skin condition called vitiligo. Now, vitiligo is an autoimmune condition, and what it does is it depigments the skin. So you're left with white patches all over the skin. Now, Alexia's got quite a Mediterranean skin tone, like me, so you can imagine how that would have looked. And I noticed that this affected not just her skin, but it affected her as an individual. I noticed that it affected people around her, the way they spoke to her, the way they looked at her. I noticed that it affected her behavior. She went from being very bubbly and extroverted to being kind of much more closed off and not speaking too much. I noticed that it was the first thing that people saw about her and questioned her about, and so it eventually became the first thing that she saw about herself. So I decided when I went off to university that I wanted to study this. I wanted to study how it is that the way we look impacts the way we feel. Now, my experience, the way I conceptualized it, was very much based on what Alexia had experienced seeing doctors. She would say that she'd go in and she'd be asked about whether the skin condition hurt, whether it itched, was it worse in summer, was it worse in winter? But there was very little about how did it feel when someone stared? How did it feel when someone stood back before touching her hand? When she mentioned that she was dropping out of swimming classes, the question was, is the chlorine bad for your skin? Is it itchy? Instead of, are you dropping out because people are looking at you differently? And armed with this knowledge, I thought I really wanted to look at what happens, how significant is the way we look on our behavior. So I began to research this area. I began speaking to people with skin diseases. I began reading about it. And in those initial stages, one of the things that I found very quickly on is people were saying to me, you know what, I developed my skin condition after a really stressful life event, after someone died, or my eczema always seems to get worse right before exam time, or I always seem to get my acne flares when I've had a really bad time with my boyfriend. So what I was realizing, it's not just the way that we look affects the way that we feel, but maybe, just maybe, the way we feel can affect the way we look. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that this is actually the case. The skin and the central nervous system develop out of the same stuff embryologically, out of the ectoderm. So right in the beginning, right in those first few days of conception, there is a connection. Nerve endings in the skin are in constant contact with your brain. So there's that direct connection between the two. Beyond that, the brain and the nervous system can influence the skin's immune cells through various chemical receptors, like neuropeptides, for example. And there's many studies out there that suggest that stress can interfere with the immune system. There's this one quite well-known study done recently that looked at levels of stress preoperatively. They found that people with low stress had a higher level of IL-1. This is an immune cell. And what it does is it helps promote healing, helps promote recovery. So people that were less stressed had higher levels. So what happened? Post-operatively, they did better. They were healthier. They left the hospital sooner. Their wounds healed sooner. Likewise, we know that it can interfere with the barrier, the physical barrier of the skin. So the skin is a big part of the immune system. And when we're stressed, we know that permeability is compromised. And we know that this is the basis of a lot of the skin disorders we see. So this might seem like, wow, this is really new stuff, but actually it's not counterintuitive. If every time you think about it, every time you get worried and you blush a little bit, or every time you're nervous and you sweat, or how about when you've been waiting for that special day and that pimple comes right before that special day? We all know that somehow the way we feel affects the function of our skin. And we know how it works now. So we know the more stressed I get, the more cortisol comes into my body, higher levels of cortisol, higher levels of testosterone, more sebum production, and there's the pimple. Yeah? And the thing is, we've understood that lifestyle factors, that emotional factors play a part in gastrointestinal systems or hypertension. And I think it's time we start looking at it in the same way, that skin disease has the same capacity. So this is what I wanted to research. So I've done many studies in this area over the years, but I want to tell you briefly about one in particular. This was one of my first studies that actually I did for my doctoral work. And I looked at vitiligo, Alexia's condition, and I wanted to see if cognitive behavior therapy, which is a kind of therapy that impacts the way we think about things in life, in this case our skin disease, could reduce stress, and then consequently, if that reduction could affect body image and self-esteem and quality of life. So we recruited a group of people, and we gave them CBT for 8 weeks. Another group of people, we gave them just talking therapies. They could talk about whatever they wanted, not about their skin disease, not CBT, but just open-ended therapy. And we had another control group. The group that received the CBT was able to improve significantly in terms of body image, in terms of quality of life, and in terms of self-esteem. And this was maintained at 6 months and a year. But beyond that, we actually also saw an improvement, a significant improvement in the skin condition of a lot of those people. So we realized that what we'd managed to do is address a central issue in the illness process, and an issue that very sadly isn't addressed. A lot of times when someone comes in and says, I have a skin condition, it's the condition that's treated, not the person. And if in fact this connection between mind and body exists, and we're not treating it, then we're missing something out. So, what did we learn? Well, we learned that the stories we tell ourselves about the illness matter. I've done work in this area as a research scientist, as a psychologist for years. And what I find when it comes to illness, any illness, the stories that we tell ourselves, why we got the illness, what we should do to make it better, these will determine how we act, how we seek help, how we stick to treatment. There was one guy I remember who came to see me, and it was July, really hot, one of those sticky London Julys, and he came and he had his shirt done up and his sleeves down, and I asked him, aren't you warm? And he said, well, I hate anyone seeing the vitiligo. And we began talking. He opened up and explained that he developed vitiligo around his groin when he was a teenager. And so it was mixed up with all these feelings of shame and angst and sexual confusion. And it wasn't until he was able to get therapy and reframe how he saw the illness and the meanings of the illness that he was able to deal with it emotionally in a much more healthy way, but also he was able to regain some of his quality of life back. And this is someone who, for years after that encounter, would write to me and say, it's freezing outside, but I refuse to take my shorts off because this is my illness and I refuse to be ashamed of it. I also learned that the severity of a condition will have no bearing on how an individual experiences it. We make this assumption that the worse you look, the worse you feel, but that's not the case. It's a really individual thing. I remember working with a dancer once, a beautiful girl, who came in and she had eczema lesions on her legs, and she was devastated by this. Her identity was so bound up in her legs. So you can imagine her sitting across from a doctor that was saying, well, it's not going to kill you. I can't see it, so you must be fine. It doesn't matter what we see as health professionals. What matters is the individual's experience. I learned, indeed, that even though a condition isn't physically handicapping, it doesn't mean it's not psychologically handicapping. Psychologically, one of the things that we do to protect ourselves is avoid. So if I decide that this skin condition is something that's going to cause me problems, people are going to ask me about it, I'm going to feel uncomfortable, not just make my world smaller. I decide, well, I'm not going to date until it goes away. I'm not going to go for the job until it goes away. I'm just going to put my life on hold. And this is a significant problem because the smaller our worlds get, the more difficult it is to come out of that comfort zone, right? The only way to improve confidence is to do things that we never thought we could do. And illnesses, especially those that have this visible factor, get in the way of that many times. And finally, and really importantly, I learned that there is a potential for a vicious cycle of skin disease, whereby the worse my skin gets, the worse I feel, and the worse I feel, the worse my skin becomes. So this is what we learned with this study, and ever since then, this was back in the late 90s, and we did this study. The future of psychodermatology really took off. There's so many more people working in the area now. There's 3 permanent posts of psychologists and dermatology units in the UK. In fact, one of them is held by one of my old PhD students, an amazing clinician called Alexandra Mazzara. Now, when she was doing her PhD with me, we did some research, so she went to the Royal Free Medical School. And as part of that, she had such an impact on the department and helping people with their skin conditions that won an innovation award, a clinical innovation award from the government. And since then, she's one of the most valued practitioners there. I saw her a couple of weeks ago, and I told her I was doing this talk, and I said, how are things going? She said, well, actually, we've just had a review of the service, and we've had some great stats. She said that in the last review, 44% of the dermatology patients had been discharged because of the work that she'd done with them. 44%. She said 22% had either discontinued or avoided systemic therapies altogether, and 18% who were long-term unemployed because of their illness or because of the way they thought about their illness, which is key, had managed to return back to work. So we're really missing a beat if we don't acknowledge the fact that the way we think impacts the way that we feel, and we don't start understanding and treating people in a way that allows them to address the things that really matter to them in terms of their illness. Now, when I speak to Alexandra and other clinicians in the field, and we look at what patients tell us, they tell us 5 core things. One is that they need to have the psychosocial impact addressed. Every other illness you have, no one will ask you about. I can't see if you have an ulcer. I can't really see if you have diabetes. When you have a skin disease, I feel that I can see it. So all of a sudden, it's not just yours. I can ask you, I can stare, I can wonder whether to touch it or not. So knowing how to deal with the stares, the awkward questions is key. An acknowledgement of that is vital. Understanding indeed how to improve your own lifestyle choices, how the reduction of stress can have an impact not just on your emotional health, but your physical health is so important. Developing strategies to deal with uncertainty. Now, this is an important one. People talk about the disfiguring component of certain skin diseases, but actually there's this added pressure that it's constantly changing. So if I'm living with a scar, that's it, I know where the scar is. I don't wake up tomorrow and it's bigger or it's moved or it's redder. If I'm living with a skin disease, I'm constantly adapting to a changing body image. And needing to constantly adapt means learning to live with that uncertainty. And again, that's a strategy that needs to be developed, as does needing to be encouraged by not being defined by the condition. Like I said earlier, if that's the first thing everybody sees about you, you need to remember what you see about yourself so this doesn't become definitive of who you are. And finally, and really importantly, understanding the links between our thoughts and our condition. We need to begin to disrupt the way we think about skin disease. We need to view it in the same way that we view hypertension, that we view ulcers, that we view illnesses that we're certain are impacted by our mental health. I think it was this disruption that allowed those patients in that first PhD research to gain improvements. I certainly think it was rethinking her illness that helped my cousin Alexia feel so much better about her condition as well, because she was no longer defined by it, and she's much happier with who she is today. And I think until we understand that it's time we give patients a sense of entitlement to ask for help that is more holistic, until we begin to treat the patient, not just the person, then we'll never be really looking at the whole story when it comes to skin disease. Thanks very much.